In the sun-scorched badlands of 1950s Nevada, a war widow with 15 cents in her hand was about to unlock a secret that powerful men had buried for decades. What started as a simple real estate purchase took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 51 million reasons why the vault had been sold for less than a cup of coffee. Maggie. Holt wasn't your typical roadside entrepreneur. For 10 years since 1944, she had spent her life rebuilding herself after Tom's telegram, known for her unwavering pragmatism and the kind of courage that war widows carry like second skin. When she encountered a rangy, yellow-eyed coyote watching from the desert scrub, returning day after day as if bearing witness, she had no idea she was walking into a web of corruption that reached from mining banks to sheriff's offices. Maggie made a choice that would lead to 23 officials losing their positions, 14 businesses closing their doors, and one town finally exhaling secrets it had held for 25 years. What began as a 15-cent gamble on a condemned vault would become a reckoning that shook Nevada's power structure to its foundation. The town of Linden would never be the same after a woman with nothing to lose decided that silence cost more than speaking ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret. Holt had paid more for a cup of coffee than she paid for the entire building, 15 cents. That's what the county clerk had written on the deed, his pen scratching across the paper with an urgency that suggested he wanted the transaction finished before she changed her mind. Or before he did. The Linden vault, Estich 1911, now belonged to her for the price of pocket change. Sign here, the clerk had said, not meeting her eyes. And here. Initial there, Maggie had signed. She'd learned during the war that hesitation cost more than mistakes. When Tom's telegram came in '44, she'd stood at the Western Union counter and read it twice before the words became real. After that, she stopped waiting for certainty. You move forward or you didn't move at all. Now, standing on the sun-bleached asphalt of Highway 50, she stared at her 15-cent purchase and wondered if she'd finally made the mistake. Hesitation was supposed to prevent the building squatted against the Nevada desert like something that had grown there rather than been built. Steel doors, reinforced concrete, narrow windows barred with iron that had rusted to the color of dried blood. A faded sign above the entrance read, "The Linden Vault," in letters that had once been gold. Established 1911, according to the smaller text beneath, back when this stretch of highway was still a wagon trail and prospectors thought the desert would give up its silver forever. It hadn't, of course. The mines had gone bust by 1930, and the vault that had once held the fortunes of optimistic men had held nothing but dust and rumors ever since. Or so they'd told her. You really bought it? Maggie turned to find Lucy Grant leaning against her pickup truck, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone watching a friend make a spectacular error in judgment. Lucy ran the only diner in Linden still serving food, a weather-beaten establishment called Grant's that offered coffee strong enough to strip paint and pie that made the coffee worthwhile. I really did, Maggie said. For 15 cents, I've made worse investments. Maggie pulled the key from her pocket, heavy brass, old enough that its teeth were worn smooth in places. I'm thinking pie and coffee, maybe burgers. Travelers need a place to stop between Ely and Fallon. Lucy pushed off from the truck and walked closer, her boots crunching on gravel. Her eyes weren't on Maggie. They were on the vault, and they carried the same wary expression the county clerks had worn. Maggie, Lucy said quietly, why do you think they sold it to you for 15 cents? Because it's been empty for 20 years, and nobody wants it. Because nobody wants what's inside it. Lucy's voice dropped even lower. The condemned notice on that door is from last year. The lock is new. You notice that? Maggie had noticed. She'd noticed a lot of things. The way people in Linden watched her from their storefronts and porches when she drove through town. The way conversation stopped when she asked about the vault. The way the previous owner, a lawyer from Reno who'd inherited it from an estate, had practically thrust the deed at her and driven away before the ink dried. A dust devil skittered across the highway, spinning itself into a brief tornado of grit and sage before collapsing back into nothing. Somewhere out in the scrub, a coyote watched from behind a Joshua tree. Maggie had seen it there yesterday too, and the day before that. A rangy, yellow-eyed thing that looked like it survived on rabbits and determination. "I'm not afraid of ghosts," Maggie said. "Maybe you should be." Lucy glanced back toward town, toward the handful of buildings that comprised Linden's entire commercial district. "Just, if you're going down to the basement, don't go alone, all right? There's a basement?" "There's always a basement." Lucy managed a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Come by Grant's tomorrow. Coffee's on me. We'll talk about your roadside empire." She climbed back into her truck and drove away, leaving Maggie alone with her 15-cent purchase and the coyote that watched from the shadows. The key turned smoothly in the new lock. Too smoothly. Someone had been maintaining this place, even if they wanted everyone to believe it was abandoned. The steel door swung open on hinges that didn't squeak. Inside, the air tasted of concrete dust and something else, something metallic that made Maggie think of the smell of storms before they broke. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space. The main room was larger than she'd expected, maybe 30 feet square, with a high ceiling and walls thick enough to stop a freight train. A long counter ran along one side, its surface scratched and stained but still solid. Behind it, the wall bore a single painted line in faded red, exactly at eye level, labeled with numbers she didn't understand. The windows were intact beneath their boards. No fire damage, no water stains. The floor was swept clean, too clean. Maggie ran her hand along the counter, her fingers finding grooves worn by years of elbows and paperwork. This had been a working space once, a place where money changed hands and futures were promised or destroyed. Now it was just empty, except for the silence and the questions. Behind the counter, she found what she was looking for: the access to the lower level. A steel hatch set flush with the floor, secured with a padlock that looked as new as the door lock. But the hatch wasn't what caught her attention. It was the warped section of the countertop, where water damage had caused the wood to buckle upward. And wedged in the gap between the counter and the wall, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was a brass key, smaller than the one she'd used to open the building. Tagged with a piece of paper that had yellowed with age, 2 letters written in faded ink. H.D. Maggie pocketed the key and straightened, her pulse quickening in a way it hadn't since the war. Since the night she'd discovered Tom's orders hidden in his desk drawer, and realized 6 months before the telegram came that he wasn't coming home. That night, the wind began to blow. It started as a whisper against the steel door, then grew into something stronger, rattling the boards over the windows and sending sand hissing against the concrete walls. Maggie locked up and drove back to the room she was renting above Grant's diner, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd missed something important. Something everyone in Linden knew but wouldn't say. That night, lying in bed and listening to the wind howl down Highway 50, she heard it, a click, faint, distant, coming from the direction of the vault, the sound of a lock releasing. Maggie returned to the vault at dawn, when the desert light turned everything the color of old gold, and the coyote was a shadow disappearing into the scrub. The hatch was still locked. The building was still empty, but the sound from the night before had been real, and Maggie had learned during the war that the things that wake you at 3 a.m. are usually the things you need to pay attention to. She'd brought a flashlight, a crowbar, and a measuring tape. The kind of tools a woman brings when she's planning to open a roadside diner. The kind of tools a woman brings when she's planning to find out what 15 cents actually bought. The padlock on the hatch yielded to the bolt cutters she'd borrowed from Lucy. The hatch itself groaned open on hinges that hadn't been oiled in years, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness. The basement was too clean. That was Maggie's first thought when her flashlight beam swept across the space below. Concrete floor, concrete walls, concrete ceiling reinforced with steel beams. No debris, no rat droppings, no evidence of water seepage. Just clean, swept concrete and the smell of old air. The space was maybe 15 feet square. A single room with no doors, no windows, nothing but bare walls and emptiness. Except Maggie pulled out the measuring tape and began to measure. The interior dimensions of the basement, the thickness of the walls, she could calculate from the windows above. Then she went back upstairs and measured the building's exterior. The numbers didn't match. The vault's footprint from outside was at least 30 feet wider than the interior spaces she could access. Somewhere in the concrete and steel, there was at least 15 feet of missing space. Maybe more. She descended the ladder again, moving slowly, her flashlight beam searching every inch of the walls and floor. On her third pass, she found it, a seam in the concrete so fine it was almost invisible, running in a rough circle about 4 feet in diameter. It bisected the floor in the northwest corner, nearly hidden beneath a thin layer of dust that looked deliberately placed. Maggie knelt and traced the seam with her fingers. It was real. A hatch within a hatch, a false basement hiding something deeper. The brass key with the HD tag was in her pocket. She pulled it out, studying it in the flashlight beam. Too small for a padlock, but the right size for a pin mechanism. The kind of lock that didn't require a keyhole. Just the right sequence of pressure points. She pressed the key against the seam at 12. O'clock, nothing. 3 o'clock, nothing. 6 o'clock, click, the sound she'd heard the night before. Section of floor 6 inches to the left of the seam shifted, rising perhaps a 1/4 inch. Maggie wedged her crowbar into the gap and pried. The circular section of concrete lifted like a manhole cover, revealing a narrow stairwell that descended into perfect darkness. The air that rose from below was different, cooler, drier, and carrying that metallic scent she'd noticed when she first entered the building. Like old coins, like locked boxes and forgotten promises. Going somewhere? Maggie spun, her flashlight beam catching a figure at the top of the ladder. A man, backlit by the morning light from above, his face in shadow. The vault's closed, Maggie said, keeping her voice steady. I own it now. I know. The man descended the ladder slowly, his movements careful in a way that suggested age or old injuries. When he reached the bottom, Maggie's flashlight beam revealed a face weathered by decades of desert sun, eyes that had seen things they'd rather forget. I'm Joe Calder. Worked this site back in the 40s before they sealed it up. Sealed what up? Joe's gaze moved to the open hatch in the floor, to the stairwell descending into darkness. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. You really want to go down there? I really do. Some doors, Joe said quietly, seal behind you. Once you know what's down there, you can't unknow it. And there's people in this town, people in this county, who'd prefer you stayed ignorant. Maggie thought about the county clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. The way Lucy had warned her about basements. The coyote that watched from the shadows. Surviving on the margins, because the desert didn't leave room for the careless. I stopped worrying about other people's preferences in 1944, Maggie said. She started down the stairs. Joe followed. The stairwell descended at least 20 feet, the walls changing from poured concrete to limestone blocks that predated the vault above. Someone had carved this space out of the bedrock itself, then hidden it beneath layers of concrete and locks and deliberate forgetting. At the bottom, Maggie's flashlight found a chamber roughly 10 feet square. The walls were lined with ancient wiring, the kind they'd used in the 20s, coated in cloth insulation that had gone brittle with age. In the corner, sitting on a metal shelf, was a device she recognized from Tom's office at the base, a dictaphone unit, one of the old cylinder models that recorded voices on wax. The unit was cracked, its speaker cone dented, but the label was still legible, property of H. Draper. Linden Savings and Trust. Henry Draper, Joe said from behind her. He owned the vault, ran a mining bank until it went under in 31. He disappeared the next year. Some said he ran off with what was left of the money. Others said the desert took him. Maggie lifted the dictaphone carefully. A cylinder was still loaded in the mechanism, protected by a glass shield. The wax showed the grooves of a recording, preserved in the dark and the dry air. "What's on it?" she asked. "If I knew that," Joe said, "I wouldn't have spent the last 20 years trying to forget I helped build this place." Maggie found a canvas sack in the corner, rotted through in places, but still serviceable, and carefully packed the dictaphone inside. Whatever Henry Draper had wanted to preserve down here, whatever was worth building a hidden chamber and sealing it with brass keys and fear, she was going to find out. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight beam caught something else. Scratched into the limestone wall, almost invisible, a message in the same hand that had written HD on the key tag. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second chamber requires 2 keys, mine and the Reverend's. God help whoever finds them both. Lucy's diner was closed when Maggie knocked on the back door at midnight, but the lights were on in the workshop behind the kitchen. Lucy opened the door with a soldering iron in one hand and coffee in the other. "Tell me you didn't go down there," Lucy said. Maggie held up the canvas sack. Lucy sighed and stepped aside. "Get in here before someone sees." The workshop was cluttered with the mechanical debris of a working diner, a disassembled mixer, the guts of a refrigerator compressor, a radio that Lucy had been rebuilding for months. A coffee pot sat on a hot plate, surrounded by rings from dozens of late-night repairs. Maggie set the sack on the workbench and carefully extracted the dictaphone. "Jesus," Lucy breathed. "Is that what I think it is? Property of Henry Draper." Maggie found the cylinder release and gently removed the wax recording. "You said you've been working on that radio. Can you rig this to play?" Lucy was already reaching for tools. "The mechanism's shot, but if the wax is intact, I can wire the pickup to a speaker." She studied the cylinder, holding it up to the light. "This is old, Maggie. Really old. If it breaks, it won't break." Maggie poured them both coffee. "And if it does, at least we tried." They worked in silence, Lucy's hands steady as she connected wires and tested voltages. The soldering iron hissed. The coffee pot burbled. Outside, a truck drove past on Highway 50, its headlights briefly illuminating the window before fading into the desert night. It took an hour. Lucy rigged a manual turntable from a broken record player, attached the dictaphone's pickup arm, and connected everything to the radio's speaker system. When she finally flipped the switch, static filled the workshop, then something else, a voice, scratchy, distant, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably real. Custodial agreements remain in effect through fiscal year 1931. All parties acknowledge the necessity of discretion. The Reverend understands the cost of mercy. The sheriff understands the cost of order. And I, the voice broke into static, then clarified, understand the cost of silence. Henry Draper's voice. Haughty, paranoid, the voice of a man who'd built something terrible and wanted credit for his cleverness. The second chamber is complete. Numbers to satisfy the sheriff: $8,400 in March, $11,200 in June, $14,600 in September. Silent partners include Rawlings Ranch, $6,000, Mercy Mine, Consortium, $22,000. Henderson Widows Fund, $3,400, all amounts held in safekeeping for future distribution. Lucy's hand found Maggie's arm and squeezed hard. "For distribution," the voice repeated, and now there was something ugly in it. Something that made Maggie think of the county clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. Payment schedules attached in ledger form. The Reverend will note appropriate charitable expenses. The sheriff will note appropriate civic expenses. And I will note static again. The wax cylinder spun on, but the voice was gone, replaced by a hiss that might have been breath or might have been the sound of decades eating away at wax and words and evidence. Then, "If anyone finds this, know that I did what was necessary. Know that the town survived because of what we hid." Know that mercy and theft are sometimes the same coin, spent in different stores. Silence. Lucy switched off the turntable with shaking hands. "That's a ledger," she said quietly. "He's describing a ledger. Names, amounts, distributions. Maggie, he was skimming from everyone. The ranches, the mines, the widows, and paying off the sheriff and the reverend to keep quiet. Maggie's mind was racing, connecting pieces. The vault that had been maintained despite being abandoned. The condemned notice that was too new. The way people in Linden looked at the building, like it was a grave they couldn't visit, but couldn't forget. "You have to sell this place," Lucy said. "Tonight, tomorrow morning. Whatever you paid, I'll double it, triple it. Just walk away before what?" Maggie's voice was harder than she'd intended. She softened it. "Lucy, if there's a ledger, if there are names, those people deserve to know what happened to their money, what happened to their family's money. Those people are dead. Not all of them." Maggie thought about the Henderson Widows Fund. There was still a Henderson's General Store in Linden, run by an old woman who never smiled. And if they're not dead, they're still being bled dry by whatever replaced Draper's arrangement. That deputy who sits outside the vault at night? The one you told me was there to deter vandals? Lucy's silence was answer enough. Maggie lifted the dictaphone cylinder, holding it up to the light, the way Lucy had. The grooves in the wax held more than Draper's voice. They held names, dates, evidence. They held the truth about why a building was sold for 15 cents, because truth that cheap is truth no one wants to pay for. "I'm going back down," Maggie said. "Draper mentioned a second chamber. If there's a ledger, that's where it is. He said it required 2 keys, Lucy reminded her. "Yours and the Reverend's. Then I guess I'm going to church." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, studying Maggie the way she studied broken machinery, looking for the weak point, the place where pressure would make things crack. Finally, she sighed. "You're really going to do this?" "I really am." "Then you're not doing it alone." Lucy stood and moved to a locked cabinet above the workbench. Inside were tools that had nothing to do with diner equipment. Wire cutters, signal detectors, the kind of equipment you'd use if you needed to check for surveillance devices. "If you're going to church tomorrow, we're going to make sure nobody's listening in." "And Maggie?" She turned and her eyes were fierce. "If this goes wrong, if Sheriff Whitaker or anyone else comes for you, I'm calling the state police. Hell, I'm calling the governor. I don't care who I have to wake up." Maggie felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of isolation she'd been carrying since Tom's telegram. Since the moment she'd realized she was alone in a world that kept spinning regardless. "Thank you," she said. Lucy just handed her a cup of coffee and started rewinding the dictaphone cylinder. "We're going to need to make a copy of this. And then you're going to tell me exactly what you found in that basement." So Maggie told her. About the false basement, about the hidden stairwell, about Joe Calder and his warning about doors that seal behind you, about the message scratched into the limestone. The second chamber requires 2 keys, and about how she'd decided, standing in that dark chamber with Henry Draper's voice echoing in her ears, that some doors were meant to be opened, even if they sealed behind you, especially then. The church was empty when Maggie arrived, afternoon lights slanting through windows that needed washing. Reverend Cole Matthews sat in the front pew, not praying exactly, just sitting with the stillness of a man who'd run out of prayers that worked. He looked up when her footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. No surprise in his eyes. He'd been expecting her, Miss Holt. His voice was tired. "I wondered how long it would take." Maggie didn't sit. "Henry Draper mentioned you in his recording. Said you understood the cost of mercy. Did he?" The Reverend's hands rested on his knees, liver-spotted and steady. Henry understood a lot of things. Most of them wrong, but not all. He was stealing from widows. From miners who'd lost everything, he was keeping the town alive. Cole stood slowly, moving to the collection box mounted on the wall. In 1931, this county had nothing. The mines were played out, the banks were failing, and people were starving. Not metaphorically starving, actually starving. "I buried 6 children that winter, so you let him rob them." I let him redistribute funds in ways that kept families fed and the lights on. The Reverend opened the collection box with a small key from his pocket. Inside, among the scattered coins and crumpled bills, was another key. Steel, notched in a pattern that looked like teeth. Stamped with tiny letters, LV2, he held it out to Maggie. His hand didn't shake. Mercy sometimes requires unclean vessels, Miss Holt. I made peace with that a long time ago. The question is whether you can make peace with what you'll find when you use this. Maggie took the key. It was heavier than she expected. Sheriff Whitaker, she said. He keeps the peace by choosing what not to see. Dean Whitaker keeps the peace by deciding what peace looks like. Cole closed the collection box. If you go below, take someone who knows when to stop digging. And Miss Holt, whatever you find, remember that the people who suffered most are the ones still living here. Exposure can be another kind of violence, or another kind of justice. Sometimes, ordered the Reverend said quietly, they're the same thing wearing different faces. Pre-dawn cold bit through Maggie's jacket as she and Joe descended into the vault's hidden levels. Work lamps cast harsh shadows on limestone walls, making the stairs seem to spiral deeper than memory allowed. The steel door marked LV2 was flush with reinforced concrete, sealed so tightly it looked like part of the wall. Joe ran his fingers along the edges, searching for the mechanism Draper had designed 20 years before. Mining trick, Joe muttered, finding a pin hidden in shadow. You don't pull these doors open. You release the pressure that holds them shut. He inserted the Reverend's key, twisted, then pressed 3 points simultaneously. Something deep in the concrete groaned. The door exhaled inward. The chamber beyond was larger than the first, maybe 20 feet deep, lined floor to ceiling with olive crates. Stenciled shipping marks showed dates spanning 2 decades, 1929, 1931, 1935, 1942. The rubber bands holding the bundles of cash had cracked with age, spilling bills across the nearest crate like autumn leaves. Maggie's hands trembled as she lifted the ledger from its place atop the center stack. Hardbound, leather-cracked, pages yellowed but legible. Names, dates, amounts, deposits and withdrawals. And in the margin of nearly every page, in Draper's precise script, Whitaker's cut. Sweet Jesus, Joe breathed. How much is here? Maggie did the math in her head, flipping through pages that documented systematic theft disguised as civic necessity. 50 million, maybe more. Joe's face had gone grey. He moved to the far corner where the dates were oldest, to crates marked 1931. His fingers traced the stenciled numbers like reading braille. The cave-in, he said. The one that supposedly killed 3 men and sealed off the old mine shaft. That was the year Draper vanished. You were there. I helped dig it. Joe's voice was hollow. Whitaker paid us double to work fast, to seal it permanent. Said it was company property that needed protecting. I thought, he stopped. I thought we were just following orders. But one of those men in the cave-in was my friend. Bobby Marsh. He worked the assay office, kept records of ore samples, and Joe's hand stopped on a crate. Stenciled beside the date was a name, B. Marsh, silenced. He knew, Joe whispered. Bobby knew what they were doing, and they killed him for it. Above them, footsteps. A car door slammed. Maggie grabbed the ledger. Out, now! Sheriff Dean Whitaker stood in the vault's main room, sunlight behind him turning his silhouette into something almost holy. He smiled when Maggie and Joe emerged from the basement hatch, his expression warm as summer. Miss Holt! Heard you were fixing up our old landmark. Thought I'd welcome you proper. His eyes tracked the fresh dust on their boots, the lamp smell clinging to their clothes. Doing some deep cleaning? Inspection, Maggie said. Building this old, you check the foundation. Smart. Whitaker's gaze moved to Joe. Joe called her. Haven't seen you in years. Still doing odd jobs. Still breathing, Joe said. Whitaker's smile never wavered. Funny thing about old buildings, they require permits. Health inspections, safety checks, that sort of thing. He produced a clipboard from his truck. Need you to sign some county paperwork. Standard stuff. And I'll need a copy of your deed, plus a spare key for our safety file. Safety file. Maggie repeated, in case of emergency. Fire, collapse, that kind of disaster. Whitaker's eyes were pale blue and completely empty. Speaking of disasters, you know this building has quite a history. Henry Draper ran it before my time, but folks still tell stories. Vella loved his olive crates. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maggie felt ice slide down her spine. Whitaker knew. Of course he knew. He'd probably known the moment she bought the property. I'll get you those permits, she said carefully. Appreciate it. Whitaker touched his hat brim. Oh, and I'm stationing a deputy across the highway. Just to deter vandals, you understand. Hate for anything to happen to your investment. He drove away, trailing dust, leaving Joe and Maggie standing in silence. He knows, Joe said. He's been paid to know. Maggie moved to the office phone mounted on the wall. A wire she hadn't noticed before was clipped to the line, leading out through a gap in the window frame. And he's been listening. Night fell across 3 separate locations. At the vault, Maggie sat at the desk with a ledger open, indexing every name, every amount, every notation of who'd been robbed and who'd profited. Her handwriting filled page after page of a school notebook. In Grant's diner back office, Lucy cross-referenced the names against county records, building a map of money that had flowed through Linden like poisoned water. Mining suppliers, church funds, payroll accounts that existed only on paper. At his cabin, Joe worked by kerosene lamp, his hands shaking as he matched dates to memories. The cave-in, the sealed mine. The names of men who'd asked too many questions and received permanent answers. By midnight they had a pattern. 3 distribution routes, all designed to launder cash through legitimate businesses. And 2 names that appeared nowhere in Draper's web. A state comptroller's clerk in Carson City who'd flagged discrepancies years ago, and a federal postal inspector who'd noted odd parcels but lacked jurisdiction to investigate. These 2 are clean, Lucy said over the phone line they'd swept for taps. All clean enough. Maggie prepared 3 packets, ledger excerpts, photographs of the crates she'd taken with Joe's camera, and a copy of Draper's recording. Each packet identical, each containing enough evidence to end careers and start prosecutions. We mail them staggered, Lucy said. My pie supplier runs to Carson City on Tuesday. The bus goes Thursday. I'll drive one myself on Saturday. Joe appeared at the vault just before dawn, carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. A page from the ledger, one he'd tried to burn twice before his conscience stopped him. Bobby Marsh's name next to the notation, Cave-in arranged, $2,400 paid to crew for silence. I was part of that crew, Joe said, his voice breaking. I took that money. I helped them bury my friend, and I took their goddamn money, Maggie met his eyes. And now you're helping me dig him back up. That's what redemption looks like, Joe. It's not clean, and it doesn't erase what happened. But it's something. Joe carefully added the page to the packet. His hands were steady now. By sunrise, the first packet was hidden in a crate of frozen pies, heading east toward Carson City and a comptroller's clerk who'd never stopped asking questions. The machine they were building to counter Linden's corruption was crude, built from duplicated evidence and the determination of 3 people who decided silence cost too much. But as the sun broke over the desert, painting the vault's steel doors gold, Maggie felt something she hadn't felt since Tom's telegram, the weight of purpose. She'd bought this building for 15 cents. It was going to cost her everything, and that was exactly the price justice required. The pressure came in increments, each one designed to look legitimate until you saw the pattern. First, the health inspector arrived at Grant's diner on Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, finding violations that hadn't existed the day before. Grease trap needs servicing. Fire extinguisher expired. Lucy was shut down for 24 hours, exactly long enough to miss the pie delivery run to Carson City. The packet made it anyway. Lucy's supplier had been through the depression. He knew what resistance looked like, and he knew which cargo to hide under the frozen blueberries. Then Joe's cabin was searched on Wednesday. 2 deputies with a warrant claiming someone reported stolen dynamite from the old mine site. They tore through his belongings with the thoroughness of men who knew exactly what they were looking for, but wanted to send a message about what they could destroy. Joe stood in the doorway and watched them scatter his life across the floorboards. They found nothing. Joe had learned during the cave-in that the things you need to hide, you bury deep. Thursday evening, Maggie returned to the vault to find the LV2 door standing open. One crate was missing from the stack nearest the entrance. Not taken, just moved, repositioned in the main basement where she'd be sure to see it. A message written in displaced evidence. We can take this any time we want. She relocated the ledger that night, pages carefully wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in the church's hollowed hymnals. Reverend Cole had given her a key to the side entrance and a warning. Once you cross certain people, Miss Holt, the only safety is in making sure they need you alive more than they need you silent. Friday at dusk, a shot cracked across the desert. Maggie was locking up when the bullet took out the vault's front window, safety glass splintering into a spider web of cracks. She dropped instinctively, heart hammering, scanning the scrub for movement. Nothing. Just the wind and the distant highway, and that coyote watching from behind a Joshua tree, utterly unmoved by human violence. No second shot came. The message was delivered. That night, Maggie played the fourth dictaphone cylinder she'd found hidden in the second chamber. Draper's voice emerged from the static, more paranoid than before, listing dates and amounts that made her stomach turn. Withdrawals on days the church ran food drives. Cash filtered through charitable causes to clean its origins. Mercy and laundering braided so tightly you couldn't separate them without unraveling both. The Reverend believes he's saving souls. Draper's voice crackled. I'm letting him believe it. The sheriff believes he's maintaining order. I'm letting him believe that too. But I know the truth. Money changes shape to fit whatever vessel holds it. Call it charity, call it protection, call it necessary evil. It's all just theft wearing a Sunday hat. Maggie switched off the player and sat in the darkness, thinking about Reverend Cole's question, whether exposure could be another kind of violence, about how many people in Linden had survived because of Draper's theft and how many had been destroyed by it. But the decision had already been made. The moment she'd opened that first hatch, the moment she'd heard Draper's voice naming names, the moment she'd seen Bobby Marsh's notation next to the word silenced. Some doors sealed behind you. This one had sealed the moment she'd turned the key. On Saturday morning, Reverend Cole confronted Sheriff Whitaker on Main Street. Maggie watched from the diner window as the two men faced each other in the dust, their voices low, but their body language speaking volumes. Cole's hands gestured sharply, emphasis and accusation. Whitaker stood perfectly still, smiling that empty smile. Then Whitaker leaned close and said something that made Cole's face go white. The Reverend turned and walked toward the church without looking back. Lucy appeared at Maggie's elbow. What did he say? Nothing good. Maggie finished her coffee. But whatever it was, Cole didn't back down. He's still standing. For now. Lucy's voice was grim. The third packet leaves tonight. My car back roads to Carson City. After that, it's out of our hands. After that, Maggie said, the state moves or we've failed, but she'd already prepared for that possibility. The decoy crates were positioned near the hatch, filled with cut newspaper and topped with a few genuine bills to pass casual inspection. The real evidence, ledger, recordings, photographs, was scattered across 3 locations, none of them the vault. Draper had built his empire on misdirection. Maggie was learning the same language. That night, she placed the brass HD key on the empty desk in the vault's office. Let them find it. Let them think they knew where to look. The real key, the one that mattered, was the choice she'd made to speak. And that key couldn't be stolen. The state postal inspector arrived on Sunday, driving an unmarked sedan that looked like every other government vehicle on Highway 50. His name was Hall, and he had the careful eyes of a man who'd spent years documenting crimes that more powerful people wanted ignored. He met them at the church near midnight. Maggie, Joe, Lucy, and Reverend Cole gathered in the sanctuary while Hall examined the evidence laid across the pews. The ledger pages, the recordings, the photographs of crates stacked with decades of theft. The packets reached Carson City, Hall said quietly. The comptroller's office has opened an investigation. State authorities are moving, but they need leverage. They need Sheriff Whitaker alive and willing to provide names of everyone higher up the chain. How long? Maggie asked. 72 hours. Maybe less. Hall looked at each of them in turn. Can you hold that long without anyone getting hurt? The church doors slammed open. Sheriff Whitaker strode down the center aisle, 2 deputies flanking him. His smile was gone. His empty blue eyes had filled with something sharp and desperate. Trespassing, he said, producing papers from his jacket. Got a warrant for all 5 of you. Theft of county property, conspiracy to defraud, federal postal inspector. Hall stood, badge in hand. And this is a federal investigation into interstate fraud and racketeering. Your warrant is irrelevant. Whitaker's hand moved toward his holster. The deputies followed his lead, fingers touching their weapons. That money was legally escrowed, Whitaker said, his voice tight. Henry Draper established a civic trust in 1929 to protect county assets during the banking crisis. Everything in that vault is documented, approved, and distributed directly to your personal accounts for 25 years. Maggie stepped forward, holding up the ledger page she'd kept separate. The one marked Sheriff's Reserve, ongoing payments for services rendered. This is your handwriting, Sheriff. You signed for every payment. You confirmed every deposit. The sanctuary went silent, except for the wind outside and the creak of old wood settling. Whitaker's deputy on the left lowered his weapon first. Young, probably mid-20s, face pale as he realized what he'd been protecting. The other deputy, older, harder, looked at Whitaker for instruction. If I go down, Whitaker said slowly, this town goes with me. Every business that stayed open during the bust. Every family that kept food on the table. Every person who survived because money flowed where it needed to go. They all benefited from what you're calling theft. They survived, Joe said, his voice shaking but steady, while Bobby Marsh died in a cave-in you arranged. While families were bled dry, thinking they'd lost everything to bad luck instead of bad men. They survived on stolen breath, Sheriff. That's not salvation. That's suffocation with a pretty name. Reverend Cole moved to stand beside Maggie. The town already went down, Dean. It went down the moment we chose silence over truth. What happens now is whether we stay buried or dig ourselves out. Whitaker looked around the sanctuary, at the evidence scattered across the pews, at the faces of people he'd controlled for decades, through fear disguised as protection. His hand dropped from his holster. You think the state's cleaner than me? His voice was bitter. You think those politicians in Carson City don't have their own drapers, their own hidden vaults? This doesn't end with my arrest, Miss Holt. It just changes which monsters wear the badge. Maybe, Maggie said. But at least it'll be different monsters. And maybe that's enough to start building something honest. The sound of sirens rose in the distance. State police cars, their lights visible through the church windows, painting the sanctuary in alternating blue and red. Whitaker closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. Not surrender exactly, but the recognition that the door he'd kept sealed for 25 years had finally opened. I want immunity, he said to Hall. Full immunity for testimony against everyone above me. That's not my decision, Hall replied. But I'll make the call. The older deputy made a run for the back exit. Joe caught him halfway down the aisle, and 20 years of buried guilt translated into a tackle that sent both men sprawling across the floor. The deputy didn't get back up. Joe did, breathing hard, looking at his hands like they belonged to someone else. For Bobby, he said softly. And for everyone else we buried. The state police took Whitaker away in handcuffs that gleamed in the headlights. Maggie stood on the church steps and watched the cars disappear down Highway 50, their lights fading until the desert swallowed them whole. Beside her, Lucy let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like years. It's not over, Lucy said. No, Maggie agreed. But it started, and sometimes that's enough. The coyote appeared from the scrub, crossing the road in the moonlight with the casual confidence of something that had survived worse than human drama. It paused, looked back once, then vanished into the darkness. Maggie understood the message. Survival meant knowing when to run and when to stand. She'd done both. Now came the harder part, living with what she'd uncovered. Months later, the vault stood quiet in the afternoon sun. Maggie's voice overlaid the scene, older now, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the shape of truth and learned its cost. They asked me if it was worth it. If I'd do it again knowing what I know now. I tell them the question's wrong. Worth implies a transaction, a balance of profit and loss. But some things you don't do because they're worth it. You do them because silence would cost more than speaking ever could. The olive crates were gone, seized as evidence. The ledger had been copied, archived, distributed to 3 separate state agencies. Draper's recordings played in courtrooms from Carson City to Sacramento. His paranoid voice naming names and amounts that led to indictments reaching all the way to the state capitol. Sheriff Dean Whitaker testified for 6 weeks in exchange for a reduced sentence. 23 officials resigned or were removed. 14 businesses closed when their financing sources were revealed. The Henderson Widows Fund received restitution, not enough to replace what was stolen, but enough for Mrs. Henderson to finally smile when Maggie stopped by the general store. Grant's Diner expanded, adding tables and a jukebox and a sign that read, "Pie made from honest ingredients since 1946. Lucy hired 3 waitresses and still couldn't keep up with demand. Travelers on Highway 50 had learned that Linden was more than a fuel stop. It was a place where people could eat without tasting corruption in the coffee. Reverend Cole resumed. Sunday services with a sermon about repair over revenge, about how mercy meant more than enabling evil to continue. His congregation had shrunk. Some families had left when their complicity became public, but the ones who remained sat straighter in the pews. Joe Calder tended the memorial at the old mine entrance, the one that now listed Bobby Marsh's name alongside the others, who died so powerful men could hide theft in darkness. Maggie joined him there most Sundays after church, the 2 of them standing in silence that felt less like ending and more like acknowledgement. Federal Inspector Hall warned her before he left. "Money changes shape, Miss Holt. New hands will try new tricks. Stay vigilant." She'd taken the warning to heart. The vault remained hers, worthless now as a criminal cache, but perfect for its original purpose. She'd converted the main floor into a roadside stop, selling coffee and sandwiches to travelers who'd heard the story and wanted to see where it happened. The basement stayed sealed. Some doors, once opened, didn't need to be opened again. She kept only one thing from Draper's empire, the brass HD key, mounted in a frame above the coffee counter with a small plaque that read, "Sometimes 15 cents buys more than you bargained for." On a Tuesday in October, Maggie locked up the vault and walked to her truck. The coyote was there, watching from the scrub like always. She'd come to think of it as a kind of guardian, not protecting her exactly, but bearing witness, reminding her that survival meant staying sharp. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The vault stood solid against the desert, its steel doors catching the late sun, its secrets finally exposed to light. But just as she reached the highway, she heard it, a click, faint, distant, coming from somewhere deep inside the concrete structure she'd just locked. The sound of another mechanism releasing. Another door, perhaps, or another chamber. Something Draper had hidden even deeper than LV2, sealed with keys and combinations that time hadn't yet revealed. Maggie's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She looked at the key ring, at the brass HD key that had started everything. Then she looked at the vault in her mirror, standing quiet and waiting. Some doors sealed behind you, others waited ahead, patient as stone, knowing that sooner or later someone would return with the right question and the courage to ask it. Maggie put the truck in gear and drove toward Linden, toward Lucy's diner and coffee that tasted clean, toward a town learning to breathe without secrets lodged in its throat. But she knew, the way the coyote knew, the way the desert knew, that she'd be back. The vault kept its mysteries in layers, and she'd only uncovered one. That click echoing in the empty room meant Draper's final secret was still waiting. Still sealed, still patient, and when the time came, when the right question formed itself in her mind, and she found whatever key that last door required, Maggie would descend once more into the darkness that had cost her everything and given her purpose, because that's what you did when you bought a building for 15 cents and found that the real price was written in courage, not currency. You paid it forward, you kept digging, and you trusted that truth like desert rain found its way through even the hardest stone. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.